Nos corporis et sanguinis tui sacra mysteria venerari, ut de redemptionis tui fructum in nobis iucit essentiamus, qui vivis et regnas in saecula saeculorum. Blessed be God.
Blessed be God.
Blessed be his holy name.
Blessed be his holy name.
Blessed be Jesus Christ, true God and true man.
Blessed be Jesus Christ, the God and true man.
Blessed be the name of Jesus.
Blessed be the name of Jesus.
Blessed be his most sacred heart.
Blessed be his most sacred heart.
Blessed be his most precious blood.
Blessed be his most precious blood.
Blessed be Jesus in the most holy sacrament of the altar.
Blessed be Jesus in the most holy sacrament of the altar.
Blessed be the Holy Ghost, Paraclete.
Blessed be the Holy Ghost, Paraclete.
Blessed be the great Mother of God, Mary most holy.
Blessed be the great Mother of God, Mary most holy.
Blessed be her holy and immaculate conception.
Blessed be the holy and immaculate conception.
Blessed be her glorious assumption.
Blessed be the glorious assumption.
Blessed be the name of Mary, Virgin and Mother.
Blessed be the name of Mary, Virgin and Mother.
Blessed be Saint Joseph, her most chaste spouse.
Blessed be Joseph, most chaste spouse.
Blessed be God and his angels and his saints.
Blessed be God and his angels and his saints.
O Lord, grant us peace.
O Lord, grant us peace.
O Lord, grant us holy priests.
O Lord, grant us holy priests.
O Lord, grant us many holy priests and religious vocations.
O Lord, grant us many holy priests and religious vocations.
Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Intro iba atre Dei.
Adem purificatio in tutte mea.
Ludicam Deus et discerne casa meam de genero Santa ab homine Nicodoroso erue me.
Quia tu est Deus fortitudo mea, quare me reporisti et quare tersis in cedo dum affligit mea nimici.
Misericordiam tuum de veritatem tuam, Deus ame de dexis saluta de seratum montem sanctum tuum et tabernacula tua.
Et introibo d'altere Dei, adem purificatio in tutte mea.
Profite potibili citare Deus, Deus meus, caritisis anima mea, quare conturbas me.
Spera in Deo ogni modo confitebar in Dei, salutare virtus mei et Deus meus.
Gloria Patri, Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
Sicut erat in principio, nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Intro iba atre Dei.
Adem purificatio in tutte mea.
Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.
Qui fece cielo et terra.
Confite Deo impotenti, Beata Maria Sancta Virgine, Beata Michael Arcangelo, Beata Vianney Baptisti, Sanctus Apostolus Petra et Paula, Omnibus Sanctus et Corpus Christus. Io peccavo in mis concitazione, verbo et opere, mea culpa, maxima culpa. Io preco Beata Maria Sancta Virgine, Beata Michael Arcangelo, Beata Vianney Baptista, Sanctus Apostolus Petra et Paula, Sanctus et vos fratres, orare pro me et pro Deum nostrum.
Misericors tuae omnipotens Deus et omissis peccatis tuis publico te abitem terra.
Amen.
Confiteor Deo omnipotenti, Beata Maria Semper Virgine, Beata Michael Arcangelo, Beata Vianney Baptiste, Sanctis Apostolus Petra et Paula, Omnibus Sanctis et Dei Pater, quia peccavi in mis cogitazione verbo et opere, culpa mea maxima culpa. Io prego Beata Maria Semper Virgine, Beata Michael Arcangelo, Beata Vianney Baptista, Sanctus Apostolus Petra et Paula, Omnibus Sanctis et Dei Pater, orare pro me Dominum Deum nostrum.
Misericors vestri omnipotens Deus, et mis peccatis vestis, pede vossa vitam aeternam.
Amen.
Indulgentiam et resurrectionem remissionem peccatorum nostrum, cibut nobis omnipotens misericors Dominus.
Amen.
Deus te conversus vivificabis nos.
Et plebs tua habituri.
Ostende nobis Domine misericordiam tuam.
Et salutare tuum da nobis.
Domine exaudi ratione meam.
Et quam omnium sanctum.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuum.
Oremus. Reminiscere miserationem tuarum, Domine, et misericordiae Tue, qui a seculo sunt, ne unquam adorminentur nobis inimici nostri, libera nos, Deus Israel, ex omnibus angustiis nostris. A Te, Domine, levavi anima meam, Deus meus, in Te confido non erubesca. Gloria Patri, Filio, Spiritui Sancto, sic et erat principio, nunc et semper, in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Reminiscere miserationem tuarum, Domine, et misericordiae Tue, qui a seculo sunt, ne unquam adorminetur nobis inimicis nostri, libera nos, Deus Israel, ex omnibus angustiis nostris. Kyrie eleison,
Kyrie eleison.
Christe eleison,
Christe eleison.
Kyrie eleison,
Kyrie eleison.
Kyrie eleison. Oremus. Pectamus genua, levate. Peces nostras quesumus, Domine clemente exaudi, et contra punta nobis adversantis ad extrema Tue maestatis extende. Per Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum, Filium Tu, et ecum vivit et regnat et Spiritus Sancti Deus per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Lexia libi exodi. In diebus iris dixit Dominus ad Moise nascende ad me in montem et esto ibi daboque et ibi tabulas lapideas legem ad mandata quae scripsi ut doceas filios Israel surrexerunt Moises et Josue minister eius ascendensque Moises in montem Dei senioribus ait expectate ic donec revetamur ad vos. Abetis Aaron et Ur vobiscum sicut natum fuerit quaesitionis referetis ad eos. Cumque ascendis et Moises operuit nubes montem, et habitavit gloria Domini super Sinai tegens illum nubes sexe diebus, septima autem die vocavit eum ente medio calicinis. Erat autem species gloriae Domini quasi inis adens super verticem montis in conspectu filiorum Israel. Ingressusque Moises medium nebulae ascendit in montem et fuit ibi coraginta diebus et coraginta noctibus.
Deo gratias.
Tribulationes cordis mei dilatate sunt de necessitatibus meis, eripe me Domine, vide humilitate meam et labore meum et dimitte omnia peccata mea. Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Oremus. Devotione populi tui quesumus Domini benignus intende, ut qui per abstinentia macerantur in corpore, per fructum boni operis reficiantur in mente. Per Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium Tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat et Spiritus Sancti Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Oremus. Deus omnium fidelium pastor recta famulum Tuum Franciscum, quem pastorem ecclesiae Tue praesse voluisi propitius respice, dae quesumus verbor exemplo quibus praes profice ut ad vitam necum Grecis sibi cerit opeveniat sempiternam. Per Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium Tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat et Spiritus Sancti Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Lexio Libi Regum, in diebus iris venit Elias in Abbe Iuda, et dimissit ibi puerum suum, et perexit in desertum via munius diei, cumque venisset et sederet sub te unam juniperum, petivit anime sue ut moreretur, et aita sufficit mihi Domini tolle animam meam. Neque enumerio sum quam patris mei, proiecit que sere domo vivit in umbra juniperi, et ecce angelus Domini tetigit eum dixit iri strugere comede, rexpexit et ecce ad caput suum super cinericius panis, et vas aquae, comedit ergo et bibit, et rulsum obdormivit. Revesusque est angelus Domini secundum et tetigit eum dixitque iri, surge comede grandis enim tibi restat via, qui cum surrexisset comedit et bibit et ambulavit in fortitudine cibi irius correginta diebus, et correginta noctibus usque ad montem Dei Oreb.
Deo gratias.
De necessitatibus meis, edipe me Domine, vide humilitate meam, et laborem meum, et dimite omnia peccata mea. A te Domine levavi anima meam, Deus meus, in te confido non erubescam, neque riteat me inimici mei. Et in universi quid expecta non confundantur omnes facientes vana. Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Sequentia Sancti Evangelii secundum Matteum.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
In illo tempo responderunt Iesu quidam de scribis Phariseis dicentes Magister volumus atis sinium videre. Qui respondes ait iris generatio mala et adultera sinium querit sinium non dabitur sinium Ione profete. Sicut enim fuit Ioannas in ventre ceti tribus diebus et tribus noctibus. Sic erit filius hominis in core terre tribus diebus et tribus noctibus. Nitivite surgent in judicio cum generatione ista et condenabut eam, quia penitentiam egerunt in predicatione Ione. Et ecce plus quam Ionas hic, Regina Austri surget in judicio cum generatione ista et condennabit eam, quia venit in affinibus tele audire sapientiam Salomonis. Et ecce plus quam Salomon hic, cum autem immundus spiritus exierit ab homine ambulat per loca arida querens requiem et non invenit. Tu que dici reverta in domo meam unde exibi. Et veniens invenit eam vacantem scopis mundatam donatam, tu que vadit assumit septem alius spiritus secum nequiores se, et intrantes habitat ibi, et fio novissima hominis ilius peiora prioribus. Sic erit et generatione uique pessime, atuc eloquente turbas, ecce mater eius et fratres staban foris, querentes loqui ei. Dixit autem me quidam, ecce mater tua et fratres tui foris stanta querentes te. Ad ipse respondens dicenti sibi ait, que est mater mea et qui sunt fratres mei, extendens manum in discipulos suas dixit, ecce mater mea et fratres mei. Hicumque enim fecerit voluntatem patris mei, qui in celis est, ipse meus fratres solo et mater est.
Laus tibi, Christe.
Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. I hope you're not too surprised that I'm up here in the pulpit, but it's advertised that we have the Wednesdays, on Wednesdays during the season of Lent, the Lenten conferences. And today's topic is fasting. And as you probably know, you've heard from Canon Tanner, who was here, who's given you a taste of fasting. And he used St. Francis de Sales to remind us that fasting is not only for the mouth, but for the senses as well, and also for the powers of the souls and for the passions as well. So you have the senses, the eyes, the ears, and you have other senses as well, and you have the understanding. If you are curious, maybe you should not be going out to read news too much. The memory, maybe you should forgive those who have hurt you, that you keep in your memory. And the will, exercise the will, which is more of what we are talking about today, fasting. So that was mostly from St. Francis de Sales, and today we'll look at another of our patron saint, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose feast, as you know, we will be celebrating on next Tuesday. So in the masterpiece of St. Thomas, the Summa Theologiae, you have three parts which talk about God. The first part, God and creation, and then the second part talks about man and his purpose, and the third part goes back to God in talking about Christ and the sacraments. And then in each part you have various questions, many questions, and within the questions you have articles. So it can come across as very intimidating, but we have to remember that St. Thomas wrote for beginners of theology. So he was himself a master, and he was also humble. He was a master at theology and philosophy, and he was himself a humble genius, as you can say. And so because of this, St. Thomas was able to understand things that we would spend a lot of time on. So God gave us St. Thomas to help us, give us a summary of things to learn in a quicker way. So in one of the questions, in the part regarding man and his end, the second part of that, you have question 147, which treats this topic, the subject of fasting. And within this question, there are 8 articles, but sadly, we only have time for one, the first article, which is fasting an act of virtue? Is fasting an act of virtue? And notice that it's not asking the question, is fasting a virtue? It's asking whether fasting is an act of virtue. So it's not the same as virtues like prudence, temperance. It is an act that comes from virtue. So, as we already know from Canon Tanner's sermon, if you've been listening, fasting is not an act of virtue. Fasting is not a virtue, it is an act of virtue. It's an act of virtue. And so there are 3 objections. So there are 3 people objecting to this fact in this question. I know it might be a bit complicated, but it's going to be easy, don't worry. So the first objection says that every act of virtue is pleasing to God. Every act of virtue is pleasing to God. Fasting is not always pleasing to God. According to the words of Isaiah, why have we fasted and have you not looked upon us? Therefore, fasting is not an act of virtue. So this is an objection. So this person is wrong. He thinks that fasting is not an act of virtue. And St. Thomas answers this.
An act which is virtuous in itself can become vicious. So a good act can also become a vicious act because of the circumstances. So fasting, over fasting, so fasting is a good thing, but over fasting, doing it for the wrong reason, could make it vicious, could make it into a vice. So fasting, if you overdo fasting, you can break the body. You can break the body and let the soul, while the soul continue to sin. So you can torture the body while the soul continue to be prideful. That's why it's very important that when you fast with a good intention. You fast out of obedience to the church and to your priest, and not by your own will, because you could fast and be prideful while fasting. Isn't that true? Or you could fast and be vain. You can fast for the purpose of vanity, and many people do that, to fast because you want to lose weight. You want to rediscover your youthful figure, and you fast. So that's for a personal. That's a purpose that is not supernatural. It's for our own self. So it's a selfish fasting. So that will make the self-will grow even more. So you see that. So fasting is not a competition. There's no Olympics of fasting, because if there was one, it would be suicide, because the person who wins would kill himself, because he deprives himself of so much food that his body breaks down and die, because food is important to preserve life. So when we fast, it is important that fasting should should help us to remember that we are weak. So the experience of fasting, of how difficult it is, should just simply remind us that we are weak and we are fragile, and that we are dependent on God. So it humbles us. So in doing so, fasting becomes virtuous. Fasting becomes virtuous. If you learn that you are weak, if you understand that you are weak and you need God's help, then fasting would be a good thing. So second objection. So another person comes along and objects and say that fasting is not an act of virtue. So this person says that fasting is not an act of virtue because virtue is in the mean. So virtue is always in the mean, if you know what I want to know. Like, for example, abstinence. So fasting is an act of the virtue of abstinence. So to abstain from something that is necessary for the body. So you just have enough of it. So you just have enough of it. So he says that fasting is to deprive yourself from food, which is true, but it's not true as well. So again, so you have abstinence in the middle, the mean, and then he says that fasting is on one opposite, so one extreme, and you have overeating on the other extreme. So fasting is not a virtue. So how do we understand this? Well, simply put, we fast using right reason. We fast using right reason. So if you choose to fast, for example, and you get annoyed very easily. You get irritable when you fast, and then you start to annoy other people. You become very uncharitable, you become very impatient towards other people. Then you have to perhaps maybe quit fasting. Maybe quit fasting for the sake of charity. So if you stubbornly choose to fast over charity, so you prefer your fasting over charity, then that's not a good sign. You're doing it, you're overdoing it, you're doing it for a selfish purpose. You're doing it for a selfish purpose. So we must remember that fasting has to be reasonable. Fasting has to be reasonable. Another thing about fasting is if you are a policeman and you're supposed to protect citizens and you decide to do a severe fast and you become very weak, and here comes a criminal, a robber or a murderer, and you're not able to catch him because you're too weak. So fasting has to be reasonable according to your stage in life as well. So fasting has to be reasonable. So that's the second thing to learn. So just to know that, in choosing your resolution to fast, we learned about temptation on Sunday. There's already a temptation to fast for the wrong reasons, you see. So in choosing a resolution, there's already a temptation to fast for the wrong reason. So you have to be careful there that your fasting is done for the love of God and for a spiritual purpose, for something good. And lastly, the third objection. So another person comes and says that fasting is not an act of virtue. And he says that everybody likes to fast. I don't know if it's true, but he says that fasting is for the good and the evil. Good people can fast, and evil people can fast as well. So it's not really a virtue. So it's true that you have many people today who are doing fasting, intermediate fasting, we call it, and it's for the most purpose is for health reasons, and also for vanity, because they want to lose weight, which is not bad in itself. But if you care too much about the self, then it becomes a problem because you're too obsessed with the self. So St. Thomas distinguished two types of fasting. There is fasting, natural fasting, which means simply empty stomach, so in a sense we are all fasting right now. So that's natural fasting, when you are not eating. But fasting, an act of virtue, is an act of abstaining from food. So there's something deliberate about it. So it's deliberate for a special purpose. So for a special purpose, a special intention. So there's a difference between sitting around and not eat, because we don't eat all the time. But that's different. That's fasting, but it's not what we're talking about here. Fasting for a purpose. So just to end, hopefully it's not too long. So what is our purpose for fasting? What is the purpose for fasting? Why does the church ask us to fast? Well, the first purpose is to repress concupiscence of the flesh. So just think about how if you feed the flesh, which is eating, if you overdo it, if you have excess of food, if you think about food all the time, then it feeds the body, and the body, in a sense, retaliates. The body retaliates against reason. So, the sin of lust, for example. So, fasting helps with that. Second, so you fast so you give up food to take in truth. For example, when you eat and you eat too much, your body gets really tired and your mind gets really tired as well. So fasting helps us contemplate on truth. So our mind becomes fresh. That's why when you wake up in the morning and when you do your meditation in the morning, it's easier because you have been fasting during the night. So fasting helps with contemplation. It frees the mind from the body a little bit, so that when we give up food, we take in the truth of God, divine truth. And lastly, the last purpose of fasting is to make satisfaction for our sin. So again, if you have learned something from fasting, is that we are all sinners, we are all weak, we are all fragile. So we need to make satisfaction, we need to make up for sin, and fasting is a good way to do it. Fasting is a good way to do it, and I would add that, like I've been saying, that if you fast out of your own will, it probably would not go very far, and it's really defeating the purpose of exercising the will. So it's good to fast out of obedience, so that when for example, a priest, if a priest decides that fasting is not suitable for you, and you start to grumble, it shows that you're doing it out of pride. You're doing it out of pride. So to conclude, fasting has to be in harmony with our human nature. Harmony with our human nature. It has to make sense because we are intelligent creatures. We are intelligent creatures. So if you are the policeman and you refuse to eat, then you no longer can work as a policeman. So it doesn't make sense. So we are intelligent creatures, and fasting has to be intelligent, reasonable. And lastly, so it has to be reasonable. There should not be any excess, because because eating is part of preserving our life. Eating is part of preserving our existence, our earthly existence. So if you overdo it, then it becomes unreasonable. And fasting has to be should allow you to continue to do your duties. Fasting should not be an obstacle for you to do your duties. You cannot tell, the mother cannot say, oh, I'm not cooking tonight because I'm fasting. I'm too tired to cook for you. So that would not be a good thing. So fasting has to be reasonable, and it should not prevent us from doing our duties, which is our way to, which is our salvation. When we do our duties well, that is our holiness. There lies our holiness. So fasting, as good as it is, cannot obstruct our duty as well, because that's doing the will of God. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Oremus. Meritavo il mandatis tuis quid dilexi valde et levavo manus meas ad mandata tua quid dilexi. per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Dominus vobiscum,
Et cum spiritu tuo.
sursum corda.
Habemus ad Dominum.
Gratias agamus al Domino Deo nostro.
Dignum et justum.
Redimium et justum est, ecum et salutare nos tibi semper, ubique gratias adere Domini Sancte Pater omnipotens et tele Deus, qui cooperare iuni alla vitia comprimis mentem elevas virtutem elagiris, et a premia per Christum Dominum nostrum. Perché maestatem tuam laudat angeli adora dominationes et tren potestatis et celi cerum que virtutes caveata serafim soci exhortatione concelebant cum quibus et nostras voces tot miti iubias te precamu supplici confessione dicentes. Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Sabaoth, Prisum Celi et Terra Gloria Sortum Excelsis, Benedictus que venit in nomine Domini, Hosanna in excelsis. peccatoribus. Per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Oremus specietris salutaribus monite divina institutione formatio demus dicere. Pater noster, qui es in celi, sanctificetur nomen tuum, et venit regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis et debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem.
Sed libera nos.
Per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Pax Domini sit semper vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Agnus Dei qui tollis peccatum, nudi miserere nobis. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccatum, nudi miserere nobis. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccatum, nudi dona nobis pacem. Domine non sum dignius. Domine non sum dignius. Domine non sum dignius.
Confiteor Deo omnipotenti, Beate Maria Semper Virgine, Beato Michele Arcangelo, Beato Ioanne Battiste, Sanctis Apostolis Petro et Paolo, omnibus sanctis et tibi Pater, pro peccavi miis cogitatione verbo et opere, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, ideo precor Beata Maria Semper Virgine, Beato Michele Arcangelum, Beato Ioanne Battista, Sanctos Apostolos Petrum et Paolo, omnes santos et de Pater, orare pro mea, Dominum Deum nostrum.
Miseriatur vestri omnipotens Deus, et mystificatis vestis, predicat vossa vitam aeternam.
Amen.
Indulgentiam, absolutionem, remissionem peccatorum, vestorum tiber vobis omnipotens et misericors Dominus.
Amen.
Ecce agnus Dei, eccepitor peccatum mundi. Domine nostrum Deus inter tecum meum, sed tantum verbo sanabitur anima me. Domine nostrum Deus inter tecum meum, sed tantum verbo sanabitur anima mea. Domine nostrum Deus inter tecum meum, sed tantum verbo sanabitur anima mea.